In London, protesters including Hong Kongers, Tibetans and Uyghurs have held a demonstration against the proposed Chinese mega embassy.
The widespread economic turmoil and social protests that have been taking place in China over the past few weeks are attracting increasing attention. It is claimed that young people affected by unemployment and high living costs have taken to the streets in many cities across the country, while worker protests have become widespread in major industrial areas. According to initial reports, the financial downturn, exacerbated by recent U.S. sanctions, has led to the threat of bankruptcy in some local Chinese administrations. This situation appears to have triggered protests by public employees who have not received their salaries from local banks and homeowners affected by unfinished construction projects. Many social media posts show large groups marching in some medium-sized cities, especially in the country's interior, chanting slogans about high inflation and low wages. Western analysts largely attribute this situation to the pressure created by the U.S.'s intensified tariffs, technology restrictions, and financial sanctions in recent years. The Washington administration launched a comprehensive economic offensive against China on the grounds of unfair competition and intellectual property violations. In recent months, the U.S. has imposed bans on a number of advanced technology products, particularly semiconductors, and has also introduced additional sanctions against certain companies and financial institutions in China. It is claimed that this pressure has weakened export revenues, one of the main pillars of the Chinese economy, and made it difficult for foreign currency to flow into the country. Chinese companies that cannot sell their products to the U.S. market or face heavy tariffs on sales have reduced their workforce or been forced to move some of their operations abroad. As a result, unexpected spikes in unemployment have been reported, with a significant portion of the young population facing the risk of being unable to find employment after graduation. Some have described the situation as the shaking of the Chinese dream. Meanwhile, the ongoing real estate crisis appears to be exacerbating this turmoil. Some experts emphasize that large real estate holding companies are mired in debt, local governments are seeing a decline in revenue from land sales, and as a result, salaries and social assistance cannot be financed. Local banks are reportedly unable to pay depositors, leading to protests in the streets. Short videos circulating on social media allegedly show crowds chanting slogans such as "Give us back our money." Official sources have not confirmed these images. However, pro-government media have acknowledged that small groups drawing attention to the need for economic reforms have gathered in various cities. While some commentators have described the situation as an uprising against the government, the Beijing administration has dismissed such claims as exaggerated rhetoric. However, some China experts have stated that while everything may be calm in major cities, anger is building among those who have lost their jobs and savings in rural areas. In one northern province, social media posts show workers at a bankrupt industrial facility camping outside the factory for days to demand their wages. However, due to internet controls and restrictions on news sharing, the full extent of such incidents remains unclear. In addition to economic difficulties, the U.S.'s tightened sanctions are said to be further damaging China's high-tech sector and foreign trade networks. Some foreign investors are reportedly shifting their production lines to countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, or Mexico, which could undermine China's role as the world's factory. The decline in exports is raising labor costs and inflation while simultaneously reducing foreign exchange earnings. Although the Chinese Communist Party has announced several policy packages to support growth, it is struggling to reverse the risky situation, particularly in the real estate and financial sectors. The Chinese government officially denies most of these claims and says that stability prevails in our domestic economy and our reform and opening up policies will continue. Still, as the U.S.-China trade tension deepens and foreign markets get tougher, domestic structural problems are becoming more noticeable. The risk of bankruptcy among real estate giants, local government salary delays, and youth unemployment are also causing concern among Communist Party officials. Under President Xi Jinping's Common Prosperity Policy, comprehensive regulations have been introduced in the technology, finance, and real estate sectors. However, these regulations have also frightened many private sector actors. Experts say the best-case scenario is for China to ease trade tensions with the U.S. and implement comprehensive economic reforms domestically. However, the lack of trust between the two sides and geopolitical competition reduce the likelihood of this happening. The worst-case scenario is that Beijing, cornered by U.S. sanctions, will implement aggressive internal control policies and attempt to suppress social discontent with harsh measures. This could lead to an increase in street protests in some areas or a partial disengagement of the Chinese economy from the global supply chain. At this stage, the scale of the so-called major protests is not entirely clear, but reports from various cities point to a serious wave of discontent. Some foreign media outlets, such as CNN and the BBC, report that China is censoring such news and labeling them as illegal demonstrations. As economic data fails to improve and U.S. sanctions show no signs of easing, the evolution of this discontent remains a matter of concern. The question of whether the rising China's economy is collapsing narrative is an exaggeration or an increasingly realistic picture continues to be debated. In summary, it is argued that beyond the external pressures created by the trade wars, the Chinese people have begun protesting against the government due to problems such as high living costs and unemployment. While official sources do not confirm this, claims that U.S. sanctions are making the Chinese economy more fragile are gaining strength. If the Beijing government does not announce radical reforms in the near future, the combination of an internal crisis and external constraints could plunge China into a prolonged period of turbulence. The implications of these developments for the global economy are being closely monitored. The economic crisis in China is attracting attention as a combination of trade wars, which have been intensifying in recent years, and internal structural problems. Factors such as the tariff war with the US, the destabilization of the export-driven growth model, the real estate bubble, and rapid demographic changes have led to countless speculations about China's collapse in the global public opinion. According to recent reports, many factories are closing across the country, export orders are declining significantly, wage payments are being delayed, and workers and white-collar employees are turning to protests in response to the anger caused by the situation. It is claimed that the high tariffs imposed during the administration of former U.S. President Donald Trump and largely maintained by the current administration are accelerating this downturn. The Chinese press and state media are very selective in sharing official data on these economic difficulties. However, leaked reports and various independent analyses reveal that thousands of workshops have been forced to close in the country's southeastern manufacturing hubs over the past year. Numerous facilities producing textiles, electronic assemblies, and low-cost consumer goods are no longer able to maintain their previous capacity. China, which until a few years ago was considered the world's factory for global production, now appears to be losing its competitive identity to some extent. This is because U.S. tariffs have eliminated the price advantage of Chinese goods through additional taxes. Moreover, concerns about the global economic slowdown and uncertainty surrounding the post-pandemic recovery are further reducing demand for Chinese goods. The impact of this downturn on workers has been severe. In export-intensive regions such as Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu, millions of workers have resorted to protests in some areas, citing failure to receive weekly or monthly payments and loss of severance rights. Media outlets based outside the country are running headlines about mass protests in China, while the Beijing administration tends to censor or downplay these claims. Nevertheless, images posted on social media platforms show hundreds of workers gathering in front of closed factories in certain industrial cities with banners or facing off with police. Most of these demonstrations are quickly suppressed or dispersed, but videos and photos posted online reveal the scale of the unrest, at least in part. The tariff war between the US and China, which began around 2018 and has been escalating, initially targeted sectors such as technology, automotive, and agricultural products. However, over time, the Trump administration expanded the list and imposed additional customs duties of 25% and even higher rates on tens of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. China retaliated by imposing similar tariffs on American goods. At the beginning of this trade war, the Chinese government did not overreact, expecting that an agreement would be reached quickly. However, the expected agreement never materialized, and conditions became even harsher with the onset of the pandemic. Even with the political change in the US, many of the tariffs imposed during the Trump era remain in place, while restrictions on semiconductors and high-tech products have been tightened even further. Under these conditions, the US market, one of the largest buyers of China's massive export portfolio, is making Chinese goods much more expensive and non-competitive. Some Chinese companies are attempting to change their country of origin by establishing production hubs in Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, or Bangladesh, but this is also a costly process. Many other companies are forced to reduce production, accepting the loss of orders. Ultimately, employers are laying off workers, cutting wages, eliminating bonuses and social benefits to reduce costs, which is fueling anger among employees. Millions of workers who have migrated to large cities have no choice but to return to their hometowns when they lose their jobs. There too, employment is insufficient as local governments no longer have the funds to make large expenditures. For many years, the Chinese government has relied on a growth model based on the real estate sector and infrastructure construction. Local governments have financed mega projects with revenues from land sales, while large construction companies have built new cities through these projects, perpetuating the perception of continuous growth. However, it has been clear since the beginning of the 2020s that this model has reached its limits. Real estate giants such as Evergrande and Country Garden are mired in hundreds of billions of dollars of debt. Many projects feature unfinished buildings, and citizens who purchased apartments are unable to move into their homes or get their money back. All of this has led to a deep crisis in the construction sector, which was considered the engine of growth. Local governments, unable to cover social expenditures with the money they earned from land sales, began to see large deficits in health, education, and pension systems. The inability of the Chinese economy to fully recover after the pandemic has made this stagnation even more pronounced. Although the Beijing administration has announced wage increases, incentives, and social assistance to stimulate domestic consumption, millions of people without job security or who receive their wages late are not benefiting much from these measures. As companies go bankrupt, banks are accumulating loans they cannot collect. In particular, the risk of local bank failures and cases where depositors are unable to withdraw their deposits are paving the way for small-scale protests. Such unrest has been reported in various regions since late 2022, with banks sometimes restricting access to people's accounts, prompting depositors to form long lines at ATMs. Youth unemployment figures are another major headache for the Chinese Communist Party. Millions of university graduates enter the job market every year, but the slowing economy, strict regulations on technology companies, and the lasting effects of the pandemic have led many companies to freeze hiring. Although the Beijing administration has stated that it is trying to employ these young people in the public sector or rural projects, it is not easy to prevent mass unemployment. Many videos shared on the internet show young people gathering on university campuses or in city squares, expressing their despair, with some loudly criticizing issues such as the high cost of living and an uncertain future. Such news is not reported in the official media, but leaks on social media suggest that incidents of passive protest or small-scale action are becoming more frequent. The US sees the situation largely to its advantage and comments that these are the results of striking an economic blow to China. The measures taken during the Trump administration, tariffs, technology restrictions, bans on Chinese apps and companies, were largely maintained under Joe Biden. The idea of stopping unfair competition from China is popular among both parties in the US. However, global supply chain disruptions and inflation problems are also causing damage in the US. Nevertheless, Washington stands behind this policy, saying we must be prepared to pay a certain price to stop China's rise. Beijing, on the other hand, claims that the US is interfering in our internal affairs and aims to disrupt our development. In this tense environment, it is still difficult to attribute certainty to statements such as China is collapsing. Some analysts argue that China's state apparatus is still strong enough and can control large-scale crises with administrative measures. According to them, Beijing can order banks to act when necessary, print massive amounts of money to finance local government debt, or bail out strategic companies. However, such methods can create inflation or inefficiency in the long run. Moreover, the Communist Party's security apparatus is on high alert to suppress unrest in society. Still, it may be difficult to completely prevent social unrest, especially if a large number of factories close. Returning to the issue of factory closures, the short story of this development is as follows. Factories that previously exported their products mainly to the US or other Western markets lost their competitive edge due to tariffs on the one hand, and suffered losses due to supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic on the other. Subsequently, rising raw material costs and European buyers' tendency to shift orders away from China to other countries led to a significant decline in orders. Many businesses declared bankruptcy or announced a temporary halt to production. In some cases, workers stormed managers' offices demanding unpaid wages, leading to police intervention. According to social media posts, some factory owners who suddenly decided to close down disappeared, leaving workers' rights to severance pay or collective dismissal in limbo. This anger merged with other unemployed groups in major cities, turning into hidden protests. Although there appear to be no large-scale demonstrations in an official sense, it is frequently stated that thousands of small protests are being suppressed locally without turning into a single, large uprising. The Communist Party may resort to harsh measures under the guise of social stability. In late 2022, protests against pandemic policies erupted but were quickly dispersed. This time, a similar strategy is reportedly being employed. Swift police intervention, social media censorship, and the arrest of participants to prevent incidents from escalating. If China's export losses and real estate crisis worsen, these local protests are likely to become more frequent. A slowdown in growth to below 5%, double-digit unemployment, and despair among the young population in particular could create a serious political risk. Even if Xi Jinping's leadership increases repression under the pretext of national security, millions of unemployed young people and bankrupt regional businesses may not be manageable under dictatorial control. This strengthens the argument of those who answer the question, is China collapsing, with not a rapid and dramatic collapse, but a long process of erosion and tension. Historically, the Chinese Communist Party established a very tight state-to-Nawa control mechanism after mass protests such as the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests. This mechanism was supported by rapid economic growth from the early 2000s, leading a large part of society to believe in the Chinese dream and enjoy prosperity. However, the slowdown in the economy, the breakdown of full employment, the rapid exit of foreign investors, and the collapse of certain sectors are putting this silent consent at risk. Even if the party attempts to unite the people through patriotism and nationalism, it may not be easy to quell people's reactions if there are insufficient jobs and income. Some headlines listed in the international press as signs of China's collapse can be summarized as follows: the real estate sector and local government's debt crisis, the heavy blow from U.S. tariffs on exports and the loss of new markets, rising unemployment, especially among university graduates, the decline in the purchasing power of the younger generation and the failure of consumption to recover, wage delays for workers in the manufacturing sector, factory closures, and increasing protests, the devaluation of the yuan and investors' search for alternatives, the middle class's concern about common prosperity policies, and the contraction of the private sector. Although the US is taking advantage of this situation and sending the message that it is weakening China, if the global economy becomes increasingly divided between the two superpowers, the global supply chain and price stability could also be at risk. Nevertheless, White House spokespeople have stated that we are preventing China from sustaining its economic rise through unfair competition in the long term. While some economists say that China's collapse would be a disaster, everyone would lose, others say that China and the US are moving toward a less integrated economy, which is the new normal. In summary, according to reports from sources such as the Times of India, the most sensitive area affected by U.S. tariffs in China is industrial exports and consequently workers' wages and job security. As a result, there have been small-scale protests and unrest in various regions, and many factories have reportedly shut down. The collapse scenario may not happen overnight, but even a slowdown is a major shock for an economy that is the world's factory. Xi Jinping's administration is changing its domestic policies to soften the blow and seeking different trade alliances to balance U.S. pressure. However, based on current indicators, economic hardship and protests await a portion of the Chinese population in the coming period, while the Communist Party's control mechanisms are attempting to suppress these events before they escalate. Some dismiss the notion of a Chinese collapse as exaggerated, but no one can claim that the country's economy is growing as smoothly as it once did. If no miracle occurs in the short term, this wave of tension could continue in the form of fluctuating actions over time. Ultimately, with the US tariffs and technology restrictions slowing down the Chinese economy, it is not easy to prevent factory closures and worker protests from becoming a reality. Although Beijing is trying to revise its old growth model, it cannot cut its dependence on the outside world overnight. As long as the trade war rages on, the country's economic climate is expected to remain turbulent. The international community is watching closely to see whether China will emerge from this turmoil with a new economic reform initiative or continue on its path with a more authoritarian regime and repressive measures.